actors is good. Most sources, some of them really accurate, some of them really independent. But this trend put pressure on the status of professional journalists. I mean, their contribution to the democratic debate, the importance of providing decent working conditions and decent remuneration. Now, why is it so difficult for journalists' organizations to agree on a definition of the journalist? I think that the reluctance to define the journalist is partly due to the fear to restrict press freedom by adopting a too narrow definition. Of course, I should admit there is another reason. Some unions of journalists don't want any definition of the journalist because they organize members who are not journalists, communication people, students, and so on. How can we avoid the debate on the opportunity to define the journalist, maybe focusing on the definition of journalistic work, which is less controversial? So, what is the daily activity of a journalist? The journalist collects information, he verifies it, he analyzes it, he selects what he will publish or broadcast, respecting ethical rules, he shapes it, he illustrates it. Okay, but PR people, communication experts, mostly act the very same way. So we come back to the need to define the journalist. When I ask my member unions what are their common criteria to define the journalist, here are the main topics. The journalist is a professional, collecting, verifying, and diffusing information. He's working for a media directed to the people, to the public. He's being employee or freelance. He's working on a regular basis. He's doing this as a main profession. In several countries, you will find specific requirements which are not relevant from my point of view. The journalist, in some countries, the journalist will become a full journalist after having been doing the job for a certain time. I don't agree with this. I think we should consider new journalists as full journalists. In some countries, the journalist has the obligation, the legal obligation to respect ethical codes. Well, I don't think it should be a specific requirement. All journalists are supposed to do so. In some countries, the journalist must have an academic degree in journalism to become a real, so-called real journalist, which is in contradiction, I think, with the press freedom. Some definition. Well, when you cannot decide yourself, the others will do so. So we have some external definitions of the journalist. The Belgian law is defining since 1963 who is a journalist. There is a law in Belgium defining the journalist. The Council of Europe has its own definition. Some years ago, as I told you, the vice president of the EFJ, my organization, proposed a definition. The journalist is any person who is professionally engaged as an employee or a freelance in the collection, the verification, the shaping, and the dissemination of information to the public by any kind of media. This seems reasonable. Well, he tried, he failed. The steering committee of my organization didn't endorse this definition. Where do we go now? Do we still need a definition? Is this really the priority of journalist unions today? Today, the information scene has many new players working in non-traditional media. This change in the media landscape over the past 15 years raises questions about who is a journalist and how we define journalistic work in the age of convergence, in the age of user-generated content. Within the European Federation of Journalists, that question remains controversial. Why is it? Because unions have different experiences based upon different traditions and organization. The legal context, as I said, is also very diverse. In some countries, there are legal definitions and rules about the need for educational qualification or work experience. Some unions organize only recognized journalists. Some unions organize also communicators, public relations people, and workers of all sectors of media activity. Other unions also organize the people who work alongside journalists, although they may not be entitled to a press card or formal accreditation as a journalist. Another important trend, and you know it all, is the growing number of freelancers. Until now, freelancers working as journalists are recognized, providing the majority of their income comes from journalistic work. But we all know that many new media contributors may earn less than half of their money from journalism. So the question is, how do these people come under the umbrella of union protection? And what about the new information workers, those who do journalistic work, but consider themselves as content providers or content managers? Are they organized? How do we extend to them the rights and protections that other journalists enjoy? The real big challenge for journalist unions is to examine their strategies for organizing the new workforce in journalism, spreading the values of independent, ethical, and quality journalism. I do not think drafting a definition is a priority today. You know, January in my organization is an important month because we ask our affiliates to send us their declaration of membership. The EFJ is mostly funded, as you may know, by the fees of members, of affiliates. So you imagine how it could be important for our organization. We represent 300,000 journalists in 40 countries. In 2015, I've been checking the figures some days ago, we register a decrease of 2% of global membership. That is the global trend since several years. But you should know that all the unions are not losing members. Some have more and more affiliates. That's the case of our Danish member, DJ. 15 years ago, they had 7,000 affiliates. Today, they have more than 12,000 affiliates. And the membership keeps growing. Why is it? They open their doors to peer people, communication experts, student journalists. They opened their doors, but they didn't sell their souls to the devil. So I think we should come back to the recommendation of your report, Aidan, on the future of journalist unions. It was 5-6 years ago, I think?
5 years ago.
5 years ago. So it's time now to implement the recommendation of this report. The EFJ must organize seminars on recruitment in new media. The EFJ must lobby for multimedia training, encouraging members to use new technology, new forms of journalism. The EFJ must investigate the potential for innovation and new forms of ownership and funding of media, including new forms of shared ownership between the public and unions. The unions must promote more than ever decent working conditions, respect for international labor standards, editorial independence, and a culture of safety in media, but involving the workers of new media, facilitating the involvement of staff, freelance, photojournalists, and new media workers in the union management. The most important challenge is for the journalists themselves. I'll be honest once again. I know some so-called citizen journalists who are real watchdogs for our democracy. And I know many journalists who do not deserve their press cards. So let's forget the debate about the definition of the journalist. Let's play, as journalists, our watchdog role. It's the best way to protect the future of journalism as a public good. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that's really excellent. You really touched on some important points which I hope we'll come back to in the discussion, particularly related to future policy and so on. The question of ownership and new forms of ownership, shared ownership is a very good notion. The whole question of ownership is very important. One of the things I think it's worth putting into this debate, if you look at the world's, some of the world's iconic best journalistic publications, you'll find that these days they're no longer part of the marketplace. They're actually one way or another subsidized. You know, whether it's The Guardian with its sort of big foundation, Le Monde with its sort of support and so on, The Washington Post, which is owned by a philanthropist from the internet world and so on, the BBC and others who are sort of funded by sort of the taxpayers and so on. So we've already got forms of mixed ownership in which the whole question of the quality of journalism is being sort of tested in other ways. You also touched on editorial independence, and the question is how would you guarantee editorial independence and so on? And the involvement of new media workers and so on. And so you have taken a very pragmatic approach, which is actually not what a lot of the unions do. They are very, very, very formalistic very often, and that unfortunately creates a different image. But we'll come back to some of those issues which you raised. Mario Tendeschini-Lal, I want to sort of talk to you now because you're a good friend of all of the issues we've talked about. Ethics, standards, good journalism and so on. You work in a sort of a high-profile sort of Italian publications organization. You've really got good experience. We've talked a bit about, not enough I think, about the impact of the internet and the question of sort of citizen journalism and so on. And we talked a little bit now about the fact that years ago people would say once you've got access to a computer, you know, you've basically put out of work publishers and journalists altogether because you can do the job yourself. And I'm really sort of pleased about the fact that actually over those succeeding years we've seen that actually this is not the case at all. The internet is really a battleground at the moment. We see it being controlled, as Tim Berners-Lee said, increasingly by corporations and by the states. And therefore there's a battle for the integrity of the internet as the future of communications and so on. And journalism inside it is actually a critical part of it. So I'm very interested in your take on one of the big problems that we have with the internet is that it's chaotic, but it's creative and it's informative and it's liberating. But it appears to lack any sense of balance. As I say, it's increasingly dominated by corporations and states, and it's a dangerous place because it's full of very unpleasant, hateful sort of messages and so on for vulnerable and minority groups. So how do we in journalism see the transition into an internet-based environment for the future of communications, but how do we make it ethical? And how do we ensure that its acts of journalism are reliable and trustworthy? And then if you can touch upon the issue that I think Ricardo puts on the table, which is actually some citizen journalists actually really are journalists. They really do commit acts of journalism. How do we identify them and how do we protect them as well? Over to you.
Right, it seems like the blueprint for a book.
Actually, it is.
Well, as some people here know, I'm an ancient journalist. I've been doing print journalism and wire journalism for close to 20 years, and then moved on to the black side, dark side of the force. But that was almost 18 years ago, which tells you something. It tells you, first of all, that new media are not new anymore. They are grown-ups. They're not even actually media. perhaps we should begin to think whether the media word is still a useful word. In fact, what the digital tools and means and built was actually an environment. It rebuilt the environment where our lives are lived. And with our lives also, of course, our information lives, which means, on certain cases, journalism. And it's a disruptive thing. There is no transition from the previous status to a new one which we can envision, and that may be sort of an evolution of the previous one. That's what I personally think. Well, of course, I'm giving you my personal thoughts as an analyst. This not necessarily means that my company shares it. So, but they are so good that they are paying me each month to think. So, here it goes. And in this, if this is the case, as I think it is, does it even make sense to speak of the internet as an identifiable subject? You ask, it lacks any sense of balance. I mean, like the internet. Of course, it lacks any sense of balance. So does the world. And it's a dangerous place. So it's the street. If we still think of the internet as one media, or perhaps a collection of media, then we are trying to apply to the new environment the way of thinking that we used to have before that. So you had silos. You had print world, be it books, magazines, newspapers. Then you had broadcast, radio, TV, and cinema, and all the different media. And then you have the internet. And that's what we, the journalists that at the end of the 90s began working on the internet, thought it was like, that like a new medium was coming up, and we had to learn it and do journalism on it. Then we discovered that it's much more than this. So yes, it's dangerous. The world is dangerous. The internet is not just a place where journalists or others may put out information. It's just a place where people fall in love, rob people of their money, insult each other. So it's just life, which makes difficult for us, for us journalists who are in the business of providing information along all those criteria that Ricardo just mentioned, to say, well, so this is not just a place where we do provide information, be it journalistic information or other kind of information, it's just a place where we live. So how do we make how do we make this place safe? We probably won't. We probably won't unless there is a higher authority who's entitled or gives itself the power to decide what's safe for the citizens or not. We can't go this China way. And even that, in that case, of course, the potential freedom of people in that respect is not comparable with whatever existed 10 years ago there. But, we can go that way. Or we can just say, let's try, and as citizens first, more than journalists, try to make it safe for freedom. I think journalists, however you want to define them, just say journalists, have a vested interest in freedom, and especially in freedom of expression. Aidan mentioned Tim Berners-Lee and others that are myself, we are looking at the digital world and we see the powers that are building up, that have already built up. And this is another stupid thing that people thought at one point, you know, that the internet was like this horizontal thing, that everybody was, I mean, it's a network. Network, you have nodes, and you have more powerful nodes than others, you know, just, you know, nodes that provide and get more links. This is just a network effect, right? So you have nodes with more power. And so there is a power play there. And we as journalists, we know very well what a power play is. We try to, sometimes I'm afraid we're part of it, but you know, most of the times we try to observe them and describe them so that citizens can make the choice. So yes, there is power play going on, and we should stand, choose, you know, to stand where freedom of expression is. We may be tempted as single journalists, as organizations, to have politicians define, perhaps on a negotiating basis, the parameter of our activity, so that somehow we are protected against this flow of everybody wanting to do and say something. I understand that. I think it's dangerous. I don't even think that citizen journalist is the right term anymore. You know, citizen journalists, again, it was something that we would talk about like in the 99, 2000, 2001, when you had actual organizations that were organized to raise a number of people who were interested in providing information in a sort of an unprofessional way. What we see now, it's the total disintermediation of information and what we used to call journalism and certain things. I mean, you open up Pepsi.com, the Pepsi Cola website, and apart from a few logos of Pepsi, of course, you don't see anything related to beverage. It's mostly an entertainment and music website. And they're not pretending they're doing journalism. And so even, you know, people who tweet or post stuff on Facebook about what they see, you know, the guy in Paris who just happened to be overlooking the street where the two terrorists were shooting the policeman, just took his video and put up on Facebook. He didn't think of himself as being a journalist at that time. And of course, that video was the video for 24 hours all over the world. So it's just an environment where borders are unclear and will not be more clear than this in the future. So what, from a defining point of view, if you want, from an ethical point of view, I think that journalists or people who would like to have an ethical take on information in the digital world should, well, begin to think about it and try to put down some criteria and say, well, I think that if we agree on this and this and this, be independent, don't get paid by interest to write something, you know, this basic stuff, then perhaps we can say this is, you know, a good thing. And I'm a believer. I've always been a believer, but in this new environment, I'm even more than before. I'm a believer in self-regulation in terms of putting out codes or criteria by which you can you can be part of, and or not. And then the people will decide whether to trust you, up to what point to trust you. Aidan, you know very well that I'm also part of the Online News Association, which is a large, we like to say the largest digital journalist organization in the world. And in the last year, we launched this do-it-yourself ethical code. Now, this seems to be a contradiction. You know, if you do a code on your own, what's the use of a code? We don't think so. Of course, you have to agree to some basics, otherwise there is no way of discussing anything, like don't get money to write something, okay? But on many other issues, we counted 40 at last count, there may be some disagreements, honest disagreement on the best way to do it. The important ethical thing is to talk about this kind of stuff. Decide what's right for you and your title, be it a large organization like my own, or if I am just a blogger or any other person wanting to adhere to this code. I must tell people, be transparent. These are the rules that I abide to, and then be responsible for that to my audience. And as a matter of fact, in the next few months, probably it will be launched in Perugia at the Journalism Festival. We are actually building a tool, so you can, go through the algorithm and drag and drop your choices, build your own code, and publish it. Is that for professional journalists? Is that for citizen journalists? Is that just for people who want to do ethical information like a journalist? I don't think it matters very much. I think it's one of the right ways to proceed. And you may remember, Aidan, we had an important international gathering having to do with ethical choices a few months ago. And it's interesting, there was part of the meeting was with, there were unionists from a European organization that were with us, providing a lot of input. Then, when we discussed the last, the final document, there was just this little line saying, ethical choices, I don't remember exactly the wording, but for journalists and bloggers or something like that. And then the union representative raised her hand, saying, as a matter of fact, we would prefer to erase the blogger word, which was raised. And so this is the cultural problem. I understand unions, of course. I'm still a union member, by the way, but I've been involved actively years past. But they have somehow a built-in conservative approach. And we have to think beyond organizations, which doesn't mean we don't need professional organizations, but we have to think beyond those.
Great, very provocative as usual, and to the point. I think you raised some really interesting things here. The question of the internet, whether or not it's just a street and so on, but actually even on the street, there are rules. Not just the rules, but even general rules. There's a Universal Declaration of Human Rights, there's a European human rights standard. These sort of notions, aspirations about good behavior are current everywhere, and of course on the internet. But I was really very pleased that you, I think, focused on how we might define acts of journalism. And it seems to me that that is a key issue, rather than maybe who is a journalist, what is journalism. So if it's information generated in the public interest, information generated with a sense of responsibility, with an ethical intent, if it's information generated in order to sort of promote better understanding of an issue and so on, it's as deserving as protection as any information generated by a formal journalist, those high ranking and so on and so forth. But do we have a system which ensures that level of protection? So, I mean, I'm really pleased what you said here, although I think also one of your things which was very important, where you focused on free expression, it's always important, I always say, to bear in mind that journalism isn't free expression. Journalism is constrained expression. We journalists don't allow ourselves, you know, to indulge in offensive, abusive, unnecessarily hostile comment. We're not deceptive with the facts. We don't lie. We're supposed not to lie anyway. And we're supposed to be accountable. We correct our errors. These are the constraints, the framework of values that makes journalism different from free expression. But I'm very, very happy to hear about the development of the Code of Conduct and the Do-It-Yourself Code of Conduct, because it shows that there's an increasing understanding that what is important in terms of defining quality is its sort of ethical base, even if we have different sort of choices about what are the priorities for what those ethics are and so on. So I think, Mario, you've again sort of opened the door to yet more discussion, but actually, I mean, I think very importantly, and I'm particularly interested in this because a few years ago, you came to one of the first meetings that I was organizing on this issue, and I remember you saying really quite steadfastly at the time, and it was a current view, that, well, actually, we in the online world, we tend not to like codes. We tend not to like sort of rules being sort of put down, and so we'll sort of stand back. But that's been changing. That sort of attitude, which is current, I think has been changing. There's a recognition that we do need to regulate ourselves. We do need to exercise self-restraint and so on, even though we maybe will disagree on the standards of it. So I think this debate is just continuing to develop, and it's exciting, and thank you very much for your contribution to that. For the final speaker, Olaf Steenfat, I want to, you, it seems to me, you're sitting in the sort of the front row of this theatre of disaster, because you're actually working directly, consulting with media companies, helping media to sort of reorganize themselves and so on. So you can see what's really going on. And something that Mario said, which I found very interesting, was the sort of changing nature of how we see media. And one of the things is that years and years ago, when we talked about media and journalism, we were talking about the same thing. We all understood what it was. It was basically the same sort of thing. Today, there's a divergence. That media increasingly seen as the sort of the technical processes by which information is communicated, whatever that information would look like, and journalism is merely part of the content sort of process. So that sort of separation of media into its own world, if you will, is a really interesting development. So I'm really interested to see, I mean, you've been working a lot with public broadcasters, and one of the questions I just really wanted to put to you is, I have a sense that with media dealing with the issues that we're talking about, very much media policy is dictated by a sense of panic rather than by a sense of measured development for the future and a sense of progress. So, I mean, really, how do you see this for the future? And what's your understanding of how media themselves are dealing with the complex issues which have been raised here so far?
That's a lot. Thank you very much. And thank you for having me. Let me start by asking you, who of you has discovered the hidden irony in the fact that 4 acclaimed journalists are talking to you, and none of us is working as a journalist anymore, but doing many, many other things? I mean, there's a message in this, I think, in itself.
We are working, I don't know about you, but I write a lot, and I regard myself as a journalist.
Well, in my case, I think it also brings me to the definition which we've been dealing with already. What is a journalist? And for me personally, I think it is mainly what a journalist is not, and that's not fighting for a cause. Because if you fight for a cause, even if it's a good one, you're an activist, and that's just the opposite of being a journalist. And this also relates to my own background, because I started, as you mentioned, as a journalist, mainly raised in public broadcasting in Germany, in the news, current affairs, and investigative field. And I wanted to become involved, which means you kind of have to leave journalism, which I did. So, where to start? Panic, yes. I think as disruptive as the development is we are currently looking at, it's disruptive in many, many fields. It's disruptive in operational terms, workflows, business models at companies, but it's also very disruptive in the political arena because the, let's say, regulatory regime we have in every country alike stems from the old analog world and is, of course, not working anymore. Everybody knows this. But reforming it is just, in some cases, kind of happening right now, but I would say in a very, very early stage. And this is exactly what is reflected by the term panic. And this is really, I think, what you can sense in the political field. There was a document coming out from the European Parliament, I think 2 years ago, even or last year, a report where the term precarious was used to describe the journalistic profession. And I think this hints at a notion where people start to understand that this is not a dent in a development which will go away, but this is a fundamental crisis to the system. I would like to maybe make 2 points here. First is relating to your question, how is journalism regarded or be seen in the political arena? And secondly, maybe coming back to the topic which was raised earlier, the viability of journalism as business. Starting with the political field, well, I think I tend to be an optimist, and then I think there is a reason for optimism here, because the notion and the understanding of political players that there is a problem to solve is on the rise. First of all, and this is maybe a German background and observation, it starts in the legal field, where usually if you ask a politician, no matter who and where, in which country, of course he or she would confirm his or her support for media pluralism and media freedom, press freedom, freedom of expression and opinion. But that's it. And now what's happening and what I find really, really interesting and important is people begin to understand that there's a sort of connectivity. In German law, press freedom is seen as a serving right to freedom of expression and freedom of opinion, because you need media as an individual to have an opinion. Without a functioning media system, it's almost impossible to have an opinion. So this causality or connectivity is really a start of the political debate just taking place right now. Secondly, I think it's very important if we speak about advocacy for press freedom and freedom of opinion and expression. What is the vested interest of the other side you're talking to? Politicians, maybe. I mean, of course, speaking openly, they would support press freedom, but are they really serious? Are they really supporting journalism? I think there are 2 reasons why they should, and again, as a piece of, I think, optimism, slowly I think they begin to understand. If journalism dies, and this is what, for example, we see in Germany in the field of local papers, they're just disappearing. I mean, on the national level, there are mergers, they are still at least there on the newsstand. But in the regions and on a local level, they are just switched off. Local papers just disappear. And from a politician's point of view, I mean, even if we speak about national big head politicians, they have a local constituency. And what happens is they lose traction, because if the local paper is gone, it's more difficult for them to get their messages across. So very practically speaking, for a politician, they begin to feel that the departure of journalism in many, many parts is a problem for themselves. And I think it's also legitimate for a politician to try and get his or her message across. And you need journalists and you need the media to do so. So this is where I believe and I can sense that politicians really get a practical idea what the crisis and precarious state of journalism has as an impact for them and their own profession. Secondly, I tend to believe that politicians in private understand that controlling the media does not work, even if they might try. There are some famous cases in Italy. I mean, but I think no single prime minister ever in a, let's say, democratic country accumulated so much control over the media as Berlusconi. Did it help him in the end? I'm not so sure. Over some time, yes, but finally, not really. So, if you ask yourself as a politician, how do I win elections? And I think that's the main goal of a politician at the end of the day. Basically, you have to do two things. One is to strengthen your own base. And secondly, winning swing voters. And what's, in my experience, being discussed right now and what politicians begin to understand is, if you control media, and if you have access to partisan media, which is basically what we are talking about, it's great to strengthen your own base. You're basically teaching to the already, praying to the already convinced. This works quite well in many, many cases, but you're not reaching out to the swing voters, which are usually in elections very crucial. And having access to swing voters and winning elections in the end requires free, independent media to an extent. So this is also an idea which I get and understand from political debates. Thirdly, which is a really bizarre episode in Germany, you might have heard of this Pegida movement in Eastern Germany, which is very anti-Islam, but also anti-journalism, actually. They are waving, flags against Lügenpresse, which is really not very politically correct because it's a term from the Nazi times. I mean, Hitler used Lügenpresse, lying press. But what can be seen as, if you really look a little closer into this phenomenon of Pegida, and I think there are other groups alike in other countries, maybe not so visible on the streets, they are running on a totally isolated bubble of information in the internet, in their own blogs, on Facebook, but also, well, I wouldn't actually call them newspapers. I mean, they're not printed, but regular, very professionally made internet publications. Totally targeted, and if you wish, totally detached and secluded, like in a different universe from the rest of the society. And this, again, if you take this observation to the political levels, emphasizes the, let's say, importance of professional, inclusive journalism for all. But to an extent also contributes to this notion of panic which Aidan referred to. And of course, in the end, I think it's a matter of money. I mean, like summarizing it with a quote from Bill Clinton in a different context, it's the economy, stupid. If we want healthy media landscapes, I think we need healthy businesses in the first place. Which means looking at business models and value chains and trying to understand where the money is and where the money goes. The phenomenon of, again, which was mentioned earlier, of the oligarchization of media, where basically rich businessmen invest in media, I think illustrates that to a large extent, because they are not investing in profitable businesses. When they buy newspapers, when they buy radio stations, web portals, they lose money, and that's fine, because they invest in public opinion, as, a larger effort in controlling whatever. Again, as an optimist, I think there's a piece of good news, because if you ask yourself how media worked in the analog world, where the money actually came from, you would basically find two sources. One is advertising, and the other one is basically copy fee, if you buy a newspaper. Now, interestingly, if you ask yourselves about, let's start with advertising, have advertising budgets decreased? Not really. I mean, large corporations spend rather more than less on advertising, right? Private spending on media, has it decreased? I don't have any data, but I mean, from a personal observation, I think households in general spend rather more than less today on, let's say, media in general. So as a bottom line, the money is still in the system. The money goes still, into the media. The only difference is, and this is, I think, where really the discussion starts, in the good old analog days, you would have aggregators where the money went to, publishing houses, stations, broadcasters, who took large parts of this money, minus profit and taxes, to reinvest in content, right? Employ journalists, buy productions from independent producers, blah, blah, blah. Today, the situation is a little similar because you still have big aggregators, different ones, like Google, for example, and different ways of aggregation, but the revenues are not reinvested in content. The money goes elsewhere, in inventing drones and self-driving cars and setting up a satellite network for internet, etc., which is great, but this is one reason why investments in content are lacking more and more. If you look a bit closer, again historically, as Aidan also mentioned quite rightly, journalism was always subsidized one way or the other. So that's not new. So I would suggest to direct the discussion or debate in the direction of, or the question, what future forms of subsidies could we think of? Cross-subsidies for journalism. And I think there are many, many possibilities to do so, because in the end, and this goes back to the political field, people begin to understand that journalism is a utility and is, crucial for societal hygiene. You would never think of, do we need judges anymore, or doctors? So do we need journalists for the future? I think most people would agree. And then the next question is, how do we as a society make the profession work again? And this, at maybe at the end of my statement, brings me back to the definition of a journalist. I think the term professional is very important, which transpired from the presentations earlier, because I believe, connected to the point I tried to make on the economy, a decent salary is the best, let's say, disinfectant for or against, any problems which might arise in ethical ways. I expect from a journalist just basically to do a decent job, and it's perfectly fine if he or she gets a decent salary for it. And if that's not the case, I think we are in trouble. Thank you.
And thank you very much. I think you've actually really outlined the complexities of it, and I think raised some questions which are, I'm tempted immediately to throw back at you, but I think these are questions which are very, very important. For example, on the question of, you said quite emphatically that an activist is not a journalist. Well, actually, I think that many of the people who are engaged, for example, in generating information, carrying out research into all sorts of areas of really public interest, very important, whether it's, for instance, climate change, issues related to the environment, poverty reduction, rights of children, all sorts of things which are very important in terms of public policy. They write reports which are not being done by the media, because the media are no longer investing in it, and this information is really of the public interest and so on, and they would like to see it published. They wouldn't. They certainly think that it's valuable. Is it journalism? Is it valid? Is it sort of? Does it have a stain running through it which says we can't take this seriously because it comes from someone who's working, or is a supporter of Greenpeace, or is a supporter of a UNICEF, and so on and so forth? These are quite complicated issues, I think. However, you have really sort of, I think, highlighted one of the, by your statement about the role of politicians and so on. I think that this is really very important, and you're right to say that it's very nuanced, the threats. It's not simplistic just to say because Berlusconi owns Mediaset and so on, that it automatically means that there is no press freedom in Italy. I was always against that sort of nonsensical, simplistic analysis. Of course, there was always, and always has been in recent history, press freedom in Italy, of course, that's right. And the presence of Berlusconi, a bit of a clown, but a powerful clown, didn't actually sort of change that. But what it is true about, and I think very few journalists in Italy would disagree with this, that having someone with such a high profile and a certain sort of streak of ruthlessness in the way that they were working, did create what you might call certain anxiety and fear within the newsrooms about what you were doing and how you were doing it. And there were enough people who lost their jobs, some jobs in Italy, because of the positions they were taking, who would say, well, actually, Berlusconi was a dangerous person to have around. But not in the sort of general sense. However, I wonder, in an age, particularly in Europe, when we see the influence of Viktor Orban in Hungary, we see the actions of Erdogan in Turkey, we see the role that Putin has played in sort of mobilizing and weaponizing media in Russia, and so on. We see the actual impact of Murdoch in the way his unhealthy relations with politicians in the United Kingdom, which did change, some people would say, did change governments and so on and so forth. That there's this unhealthiness in that relationship. So there's a lot of issues that we're trying to sort of deal with here, and perhaps it's too many. But one of the things I want to come back to on the question that you were saying about how media that are sort of trying to sort of recognize we need healthy businesses and we need money for that. So that big question gets us back to the whole issue of, do we need new forms of ownership? Do we need new sort of models for paying for media and so on? And on what basis do we do that? And then I think that gets us into this question of what is quality? How do we define quality? And so on. So, and the work that's being done in the online journalism area is very important. One wonders, are there ways in which we can begin to establish sort of quality marks for sort of journalism and so on, or for work that's being produced? And the question of your list of who's a journalist and so on, and what's a journalist and so on, was actually very, very good. But what it seemed to me, it missed, although it's implicit in what you, and was what you said, that what was missing in that whole list was having an ethical responsibility for their work. And I was posed with this question, actually, oddly enough, a couple of weeks ago by The Guardian. You'll know that the editor-in-chief of The Guardian, Alan Rusbridger, is retiring, leaving at the end, in the middle of this year. And what they have at The Guardian is they have a system of not directly electing the editor-in-chief, but actually what is called taking soundings. They have the local union branch at The Guardian basically organizes a vote among the journalists to indicate there are a number of candidates, and they indicate who they're in favor of. But one of the questions that has come up is, well, who gets the right to vote? Because The Guardian is a very good example of a company which has an enormous range of people, from an editor-in-chief and a high-profile sort of editorial team at very high level, and big operations in the United States and now in Australia and elsewhere, but also an enormous community of online bloggers and people who are working as well, much lower. So it's the food chain is enormous. So who gets the vote? And a lot of them are doing technical work and so on. And it's very interesting. So they, for some reason, they came to me for some advice, largely because I'd been in the Guardian mess years before, also as a union leader and so on. But my view to them was to say, well, actually, you have to not so much examine the positions that people hold, but whether or not they are accountable ethically for the work that they produce. Would they be subject to the code of conduct, for the internal rules, for accountability and so on? And the moment you begin to apply that notion, do you have ethical responsibilities for the work that you're doing, you immediately begin to differentiate between types of work that one is able to make a distinction between purely technical activities and so on, and work which is creative in the way that journalism is with an ethical responsibility. So this is why the question of is there ethical responsibility in terms of defining what is journalistic work seems to me to be absolutely critical. It's also, I think, finally, helps us to move towards what I think everybody is thinking about, that we need, not just in journalism but elsewhere, which is a culture of more responsible communications. And how do you create a culture of more responsible communications? Well, I think the journalism has one great role to play in the leadership of that debate, is to say you can do it through ethical awareness. You can promote ethical awareness among people who are contributing to the information landscape about the need to think before they publish, about the need to take into consideration the consequences of what they do. And that's for everyone in the public information space, whether they're public relations people or spin doctors or activists working for NGOs or they're journalists and so on and so forth. So these are sort of some of the issues. This is an enormous this is a sort of round table. We're going to stop talking here now, and we've really opened, so much has been said here, which is very rich. So please, the floor is yours, really. Who would like to sort of give a thought, ask a question?
I'd like to speak about an issue which Olaf picked up on to a certain extent, Aidan, which is about ethics. And I think one of the major problems today is a complete lack of ethics among the so-called great newspapers of Europe. Because you have situations where these newspapers, they pay people to wash their windows, they pay people to clean their offices, they pay their telephone companies to use their phones, but they don't consistently pay the people that produce the content. And I think this is like the elephant in the room that no one talks about. And I don't see how a big newspaper can talk about ethics when it pays its little cadre of kind of staff members really good salaries, but half the content is dependent upon people providing free content and usually too terrified to ask for money because they would risk not being published.
That's a really important question, because it's about the question of access to journalism. If you want to get into journalism these days, you have to work as an intern for free, actually normally, for a while, actually often for a very long time before, and there's the hope that you'll somehow glue or become attached or meet somebody who will actually give you a real job. But these real jobs, do they exist, and so on? So there's a question there. I mean, what do you think about that culture? Because actually, even some of the sort of leading new online groups like Vice News, for example, they are terrible employers. They treat their people really badly. So there's nothing new in terms of exploitation on the internet and so on. So how does one create more respect for social rights in media production and journalism, except through our friends in the unions?
Well, I think to begin with, it's not bad intentions on the side of these employers, but simply the business is not working any longer, the money's not there. I mean, if, like in the good old analog days, a newspaper or a broadcaster would have a viable business running, there's no point in, not paying your journalists well. So what you're basically describing is definitely not nice in terms of behavior as an employer. But forced upon, I'm not excusing this behavior, but I mean in economical terms, forced upon these companies in the end by lack of business.
But should we be exposing these employers? Shouldn't we be more transparent about saying, you know, let's have some honesty here. It's one thing to sort of say we're in favor of press freedom, we're Charlie Hebdo supporters, we love all this actually, but we treat our people extraordinarily badly and we exploit them. I mean, shouldn't we be exposing this?
I would not, yes, but I would not see the corporations themselves as the bad guys here, but as victims in a way too. I mean, then still you have options of how you deal with the situation and deteriorating business. And you can simply, you know, cease operations and stop doing it. Or, I don't know, cutting, which happens already.
Okay.
But in the end, I think it's lack of business.
Ricardo.
I think, yes, we should name and shame. You know, it's the responsibility of organization of journalists to do this. And you're talking about ethical behavior or responsibility. Well, the main responsibility for a media owner is to offer decent conditions to his journalists. And when it's not the case, I think that people should know it. You know, customers should know that the newspaper they are buying is respecting or not basic labor conditions, of course.
Should say on them whether or not the journalist was paid or not for the article. I mean, and I think that that would be quite radical to do, but it would be fully within the ethical right of the people to know that information.
Yeah, just speaking about definition, I read a nice, simple definition about what is a journalist on a French magazine some months ago. The journalist is the person who tells the truth. That's I think, important for the audience, in particular. And it's important because you know that that information was product, and they do their best to prove the truth. So for that reason it was so important, actually, when Ricardo showed the definition and they put the word verification. That's the most important thing, I think. And in the web universe, in some case, you really don't know if somebody had done the check verification, they check the source, they check the information, they check. That's, I think, should be an important element of the profession of a journalist.
I disagree a little, because I think the word truth is very problematic once it gets an obligation. And we have some media laws in countries where journalists are obliged to tell the truth, more or less. I mean, it's in legal terms, it sounds a bit different. Just basically to, I mean, it's always possible to even detain journalists for breaching this law, because, I mean, try to report about Ukraine and try to report the truth. It's almost impossible, depending on where you are as a correspondent on the spot. So I find this term very problematic. I mean, of course, I'm a big fan of the truth, but in operational terms, it, you know, opens the door for basically pressure on journalists in many, many ways.
I'm sorry, just to clarify, I think that this definition in the French magazine was just provocation. So, of course, we're not speaking the real truth. We speak about all the procedure to create an ethical and...
Sure. Okay, I mean, but let's not get into an argument about the truth and so on, because the truth is the longest word in our dictionary and no one really understands it, and we can argue about it all day. So that's why I tend to use terms like accuracy and fact-based communication as being the, sort of the mainstay of what we mean when we're talking about that. Yes?
Yes, I want to come back on the... You want to say something? On who's responsible of this and this precarity, and should we mention it? Is it the role of newspapers? There was an example in France. There was a debate about online journalism, and it was published in Le Monde, and then there was answered from the pure players like Slate and so on, and it was how the new young journalists are treated online. And they were basically defining this split between the traditional journalists and the new journalists, and they were calling them slaves and specialized workers and so on and so forth. And they were putting responsibility on maybe evolution, internet, and the way people want not to pay information. So they were looking for a responsible. So my question is, who is responsible, and isn't it the role maybe of the newspapers to investigate on it, maybe not to throw themselves stones saying we don't pay our own journalists. If they are victims too, maybe they should investigate on who are the responsible, and I'd like to ask you the question.
Mario, can I ask you to maybe initially respond to that and also to say what you were wanting to say earlier?
I'm not sure I have an answer to the problem. Of course, the problem of getting the right retribution for your work, it's a crucial one. It's certainly central to the debate, the journalistic debate debate among journalists in this country right now. My company's been accused on certain instances of not doing what should be done. I think now we have a larger problem. I'm sorry, I'm not very much into this, so I don't have any details about that. But there are two things we should think. One is that if news organizations are now and will be, as I think, not just news content providers, but in fact platforms, building relationships among people and their political representatives, among every kind of relationship. Then, of course, you will have on the continuum, on the spectrum of the content that just goes through the platform, you will have on one hand something which is clearly professionally made by me or others that are paid each month by the publisher. And at the other end of the spectrum, of course, you will have stuff that would just come in terms of comment, for instance, or, and then there is all this large section of shades of gray, which is difficult to define, and we should not try to define them too much of a hard way. Otherwise, you lose that kind of things, which doesn't mean, of course, we shouldn't be paying. Going back to this kind of debates that is going on in this country right now, I think, of course, there is strong responsibility in the publisher side and so on. But I think there is also a responsibility on the newsroom side, where, certainly in my experience, the relationship between the editors assigning or accepting pitches from the freelancer with the freelancers is sometimes, it's oftentimes, I would say, a paternalistic way of dealing. A group of freelancers just put out a manifesto here 2 days ago, all right? And 3 out of 10 or 11 points they made, in fact, deal not with publishers, all the other, of course, points do, but in fact with how the other professional journalists treat them in their work. I mean, they don't say as much. This is my interpretation of it, but you can read them, and I think it's pretty clear. And so, who's responsible for this? I don't know. About truth or not, I think we can say that journalists, not just journalists, seek the truth. All right. Now, the problem is, perhaps everyone seeks the truth, everybody. The question is, how do we? All right, so it's a problem of method, and we go back and, on how do we go about. So be clear on how we do things, be transparent about our criteria, and that may be different from, other kind of truth seekers, be they scientists, priests, or whatever.
Yeah, I would like to kind of shift the debate from the responsibilities to the solutions, maybe, and I would like to ask to Ricardo in particular whether, an answer to this precarious status of journalists can come from public policy in the first place, from corporate organizations, or from the journalists themselves, or from a combination of those three factors.
We will have more chance with a combination, of course, but I think that maybe the first responsibility is for the journalists themselves. I think we lose a lot of credibility those last years. That's why I was saying that the main point for me is to convince our colleagues, journalists, to play their role in the society. They are not playing anymore that role. You talk about the local newspapers in Germany, declining and not playing their role. So I think the first step is for us to be again, become again the watchdog of our society. And of course, we need public support and new models, innovation in the economy sector. But I think the first, we are not aware. The business model is down. You were asking, Emmanuel, who is responsible? The business model is responsible. I used to work for 23 years in a daily newspaper in Brussels, Le Soir. 10 years ago, the income of the newspaper was around 20 million euros per year on advertisement and 20 millions on circulation. So it was a way to fund, to feed the annual budget. Today, the income coming from the circulation is rather equal, so 18 million, not 20 but 18, a short decrease, but it's still okay. But the income from the advertisement is just 10 million, so half in 10 years. And the new income from the digital platforms do not compensate this. Not enough. It's marginal. So that's the problem. The business model is down, and we should find a global solution. As you said, Gabriele, there is no one clue to save the journalism.
I think it goes actually back to your end in a way, because I think it's also a question of the executive and policy. Because I think there are examples around how it can be made. I mean, it's always difficult to compare, but if you take the mining industry, for example, which is a business which disappeared to an extent, which was heavily subsidized everywhere, and where huge efforts were actively made by politics after a certain time of panic as well, to lead the transition, both in terms of businesses, corporations, societies, little communities, the energy sector as a whole, the product, the grids, the pricing, climate change, whatever comes on top, very complex, but it's an active policy portfolio which was driven, where mistakes were made, where many things can be learned from. In the media field, we are just at the beginning of such a development, where the situation is still panic. Everybody knows it's disruptive, landslide, but I think it needs the same amount of thinking in terms of policy, how to basically to save the industry. from a corporate point of view, I think there are also many, many solutions possible, apart from cutting. I mean, of course, that's maybe not to be avoided and creates all the grievances you just mentioned. But I'm thinking more in terms of collaboration as well. I mean, there are some, I think, quite interesting examples, very much linked to traditional media still. I mean, if you, for example, look at the way the Snowden files were handled, or WikiLeaks, I mean, this, just by the pure amount of it, required a collaboration of, I mean, half a dozen of heavyweight media institutions to cope with, and it worked remarkably well. In Germany, we have now networks of investigative journalists fully employed by traditional media. I'm not talking about freelance people, but about Der Spiegel, Süddeutsche Zeitung, public media as well, working together in teams on investigative stories, which I think is also a way to go. Yes.
Just an example, but it's French. So I don't know if anyone reads Le Monde Diplomatique. There was an article last month on the possibility of a model, actually, and it was interesting because talking about solutions and political will, they were basically describing the subventions that the French state distributes to the medias, and we were saying that Closer, which is a gossip magazine, were receiving more money than a lot of ethical journalists. And so the proposal was to define what would be a public service journalism and what would be a corporate journalism, and then to distribute public subventions to only those first. So I want maybe to have your reaction on that.
I'm just having a look to see if there's any others. Yes, Mario.
I'm not sure whether the question was about the business model and or public financing. If that's the case, well, you know, my American friends anguished for years in the last 10 years about whether there should be or can be public support, financial support for journalism, and sometimes we in Europe we kind of mimic that kind of debate, which is totally meaningless here, since we do have, at least in each and every European country, public supported journalism in terms at least of public broadcasters, right? So million of euros spent on journalism by, you know, well, different ways, but anyway, public funding. And so the real issue here is not if, it's how, and what for. In terms of journalism, I won't get into, and I mean, you are probably the broadcaster expert here, but I don't want to get into the cultural function of public broadcasting or entertainment function. I'm just talking about journalism. Now, in this country, we have like 1,500 full-time journalists employed by the public broadcaster just for news programs. I'm not talking about, you know, like in-depth debate kind of broadcast we have. Now, I think we should use at least half of those to do the kind of journalism that market is no longer able to provide. Be it on one hand, on one end, a full-fledged Beirut bureau, and on the other end, you know, a focused attention on local news. So this is one of the things, and of course you have to stop doing other things. Now, stop doing what, you know, others can do. I mean, other journalists, other titles, sometimes other entities like Pepsi Cola. I mean, leave Pepsi Cola do the some stuff if they can do it. I mean, let's do what, you know, the market cannot sustain.
I mean, I think just to sort of follow up this point, because I think it's really very important. It's one of the roles about what future for public broadcasting, that is to say, which is, the better question is, what future for public investment in public interest journalism, which is not about just keeping the institutional sort of framework of public broadcasting institutions, which actually in many parts of Europe in particular, badly let us down in terms of their capacity to deliver quality. So it's interesting what you say about this, because in the UK, the same debate is being held with the BBC. So the BBC is now itself offering to provide focused attention on local news. So the journalism that's being forgotten and being cut, for instance, local news reporting, focus on local politics and so on, now is actually being seen as an important area. So the BBC is employing its people to examine this, provide it, and to disseminate it freely to local news providers. So this debate is current, and it seems to me the question is, how do you take it forward and how does one get behind it? Because I think European leadership in this sort of transformation will be essential. Yes.
Thank you. At this point, I want to underline another point of Olaf's report. The Council of Europe, in the Council of Europe, there is a consultative body that's called the Congress of Regional and Local Authorities. And its aim is to preserve democracy at the local level and local self-government. There is a charter on this, blah, blah, blah. In these days, they are dealing with a recommendation to strengthen the regional TV broadcasting, local and the local press. So it's true that this Congress is composed by 826 majors, councillors, president of assembly, regional assembly, local assembly, and now they are to the point. There is, so I want to stress what Olaf said. There is a strong connectivity, you say, between local politics and local media, because of course they are closing what you said before, and this is also connected to what you say about the public service broadcasting that is going on a local level more than before. Thank you.
I wonder if we're coming towards the end of the discussion and towards a coffee. I just wondered if there's anyone who hasn't taken part so far in the discussion that wants to say anything, got any questions and thoughts they want to add. Yes.
I wanted to go back to the discussion on the definition of journalist, because I agree that it's a very difficult task, and I don't know if it is really important, I mean, from, let's say, a political point of view, to define what a journalist is. Probably I agree with Aidan when he suggests this definition of journalism. A journalist is the one who does acts of journalism somehow. But from a regulatory point of view, I think that sometimes definitions are useful. I was wondering how we could frame, for instance, the discussion of safeguards for journalists, because a journalist usually, traditionally, had some specific safeguards, guarantees to his professional work. For instance, protection of sources. How do you, any suggestion on how to frame in this new environment new shields law, for instance?
Before you ask a question, I just want to answer that.
Just a short question. What's the use of a law protecting your sources when you have a situation like the mass surveillance context we are living in? Okay, so the law is one thing, the practice is... the other part of the
I mean,
question.
but I think the really practical question is absolutely to the point. It's on the table. The legislators are looking at this and saying, how on earth do we deal with this? How do we advise judges and lawyers and so on? And it is actually now very, very difficult. And it seems to me that just as you have a sort of, as I was demonstrating yesterday, a sort of a 5-point test for hate speech, it seems to me that we have to be thinking of, what are the tests we apply for public interest communications or journalism, as we said. So, what's the intention of the journalism or the writing? What's the scope of it? Is it ethically defined? That is to say, does it sort of follow according to ethical principles, that it's, accurate in its terms of the use of facts, it's independent, it's seeking to be impartial, it's showing humanity in the way it's presented, it's accountable. Is the person who's generating the information accepting those core values in terms of the way they present it? And it seems to me that need to sort of have a test is a requirement, because the old-fashioned ideas that a journalist is someone who's a member of an association, someone who's got a diploma, someone who's actually employed by Fox News, is not enough, it seems to me, in this new environment. So the question is how do we apply, or how do we develop some sort of test about what is an act of communication which can be described as journalistic? And it seems to me that is going to be done whether we like it or not, because the judges are going to have to sort of deal with the case. The police are going to come, or the security services are going to come, and they're going to say, we want to have this source of information, and the judge is going to have to say, well, what do I consider? Whether or not I say to the police, yes, you can have this information, or not. And it seems to me, therefore, we have to, in the interest of defending independent journalistic work, we have to protect everyone who is engaged in that process, including the non-traditional journalists. And this is something that's very difficult. I'll save Ricardo's blushes on this. Most unions would say that's not acceptable. And that's a pity, that they would say we'll have to live with it, but they would say it's not acceptable. So, I mean, I think we have to sort of find a way of moving forward, despite, I think, that sort of reluctance on the parts of some sections of the profession, including employers, media employers and editors, actually, to move forward with it.
What I believe we see in many, many ways is gaps widening. Huge disproportions in many ways, connected also to your remarks, Mario. For example, if you look at the US, where basically you don't have much of regulation or policy control in the media sector, you have, on the one hand, a website which I can really recommend to you. It's called newspaperdeathwatch.com, which is exactly just providing a record of what it says. Local newspapers dying and resting in peace, and they are gone. I mean, large parts of the US are without a regular media outlet. And then, on the other hand, and this is what I mean by gap widening, you have Politico, which has a subscription fee of, I believe, $7,500 per year, and seems to work pretty well. So premium content is obviously a business model, but only, of course, for a very small target group. So this is one example of gap widening. Another one is related to your remarks about public media, and again, my belief that enough money is in the system. The combined public spending on media in the EU of 28 is 23 billion euros per year. That's quite something, I think. I mean, that's, as an amount of money, a small country of its own. But if you look how this huge amount of money is distributed by countries, again, you see a huge disproportion, because 1/3 of this amount is one country alone, and that's Germany, with 8 billion euros in license fee revenues for public media. Then comes the BBC with 4 billion per year. So 2 countries out of 28 share half of this amount. And then I believe comes France and Italy. So 4 countries share 3/4, which means 1/4 is left for the remaining 24 countries. Now, if we speak about public funding, in Germany, for example, as you might know, media is a matter of the states, not the national government. We have compensations between the Länder in public media. So the smaller stations are subsidized by the bigger ones. I mean, it sounds a bit like a bold proposal, but this could be transferred, I believe, also to the European levels, where the bigger public broadcasters could subsidize, and to some extent it happens already, via exchanges, for example, via the European Broadcasting Union, could support smaller public broadcasters elsewhere. Again, I believe enough money is in the system, but it's a matter of distribution, which is policy in the end.
Well, we should know that public broadcasting in Europe is declining. Today, public service channels, they represent something like 1,000 channels in Europe. Private commercial TV, 6,000 channels. You were talking about the cost of public TV. The mean cost is 50 euros per year per person. I don't think it's a huge cost for the... Of course, if they play their role, you were right, Mario, on this. But I don't think it's, you know, if we want... It's part of media pluralism to have a strong network of public service broadcasters in Europe. So in my federation, we try to protect the sector, who is a declining sector, even if the global you know, income level is more or less the same since 6 or 7 years. So, but it's declining anyway.
Mario, do you want to have a last word?
Right. Two things. One about safeguards. I'm all for safeguards. I'm a little bit afraid of them, of debating about them, shall we say. Since I come from a country, and Elder Broggi knows very well, which is arguably in Europe one of the most regulated countries. I mean, a country where the journalistic profession is very heavily regulated, all right? I don't know of any other European country of similar thing. But nevertheless, all the safeguards that are supposed to be there are just not there. 2 days ago, I don't know whether you know about this, a journalist, a reporter, a city reporter for Il Piccolo, who happens to be the newspaper in Trieste, owned by us, but it's nothing to do with this, was charged. Well, not actually charged, had an avviso di garanzia, so it was, you know, the prosecutor officially said he was under investigation. And he had been tailed, and his telephone lines were tapped to discover his sources, because he was writing about stuff, about, you know, investigations and so on that prosecutors thought were secret. Of course, tailing and tapping discovered that the head of police and the head of the Carabinieri were the sources. And which, you know, then there's this paradox that the head of Carabinieri and the head of police were also put under investigation. But, you know, the fact that a reporter had his telephone lines tapped for a while and was tailed, yes, it raised some you know, protest, but it's just a matter of life, right? So this is why I'm so skeptical about formal safeguards, unless there is a political and cultural environment where these safeguards are put. And then money, financing, local journalism. I'm a little bit afraid of political bodies who want to strengthen local journalism, local news outlets. I mean, we have 18 local newspapers which are struggling, so I would like somebody to help us, right? But I think that local institutions should help the watchdog function of society by opening up, which is something perhaps what we as a journalists and publishers should be pushing them to do. You know, opening up their data, opening up their knowledge bases, and then we as journalists, or perhaps organizations, civic organizations, or single citizens may watch, be the dogs who watch the local or institutions better. I would use that money, if we had any, to help coalitions. You were talking about collaboration, coalitions between news titles, news organizations, NGOs, foundations, single citizens, on projects not to produce an actual journalistic story, but to build knowledge bases. We pool our resources together to gather data, to gather information, to structure them, because the information, if it's not structured in a digital world, it means close to nothing. And then link the information. Then when you build the knowledge base, then each organization can go on and use it, and the public can use it. I think that public funding could go, I hope it would go in that direction.
I have to, it's after 11. I mean, my goodness, we've actually sort of gone further than we should have done, and I have to say, so I'm really sorry about sort of cutting anyone off and so on. We need a coffee break, a moment to relax. Thanks very much to the panel. I mean, I think we've had a really, really good discussion. I think if we could bottle it up and sort of give and produce it and send it around, because there's so much rich discussion there. I think in the end, we are still left with the big problems and so on. But I think one of the most important things that was said in this discussion is that we need to talk about it. We need to bring these issues out into the open, put them absolutely on the table for public policy discussion, for discussion among journalists, among editors, owners, people who are working in online media, but particularly among policymakers as well. So I think this is really very important, very useful. Thanks very much indeed. Let's have some coffee. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.